Welcome again to Jewish Awareness Ministries School of Biblical and Jewish Studies. We are going to be continuing in our look at understanding the Israel and Palestinian issue. This will be lesson 4. If you remember from our first lesson, I mentioned that historically, the understanding of the Arab world was that Palestine was part of Syria, or Greater Syria. We'll see that in much more detail in this lesson. But up to this point, what we've looked at is the Ottoman Empire, for 400 years, ruled the area of Palestine. They joined the Axis powers in World War I. Upon their defeat, there were mandates given to Britain and France to establish nation states. Britain had the mandate over Palestine to establish a Jewish state, nation, in Palestine. Well, that didn't happen, unfortunately. Ultimately, what would happen is that Britain would divide historic Palestine into two parts. And across the Jordan, east of the Jordan River, would be established Transjordan, which would be another Arab state. Well, the Holocaust. Britain was no friend of Israel during the Holocaust, or the Jewish people, perhaps I should say, restricting immigration into that area of the world, into what was known as Palestine at the time. Now, they shouldn't have restricted it. They actually had that mandate to establish a nation state for the Jewish people. But ultimately, the Allied forces again would defeat Nazi Germany, which brings us to November 29th, 1947. The UN resolution that was issued that day was extremely important. The world was moved by the plight of Jewry, what had happened in Europe. And so this UN resolution, the area of Palestine given to the Jewish people in 1922 by the League of Nations, was now divided into a Jewish and Arab state. Now, the Jewish people accepted this. They didn't like it. This is not what we were initially promised. You took away some 76% of our land and made it Transjordan. Now you want to take more. But they were willing to accept it. But the Arab people did not. They rejected it. Well, Independence Day would come, May 14th, 1948, when British rule ended over the area of Palestine. Israel was born as a nation. Now, everyone knew that once this took place, that the Arab nations, 5 Arab nations ultimately would attack, and they did. Egypt, and Transjordan, and Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia. And they attacked Israel, wanting to destroy her. And they failed. I believe that this is unquestionably God providentially bringing to pass what he had promised through many in the earlier scripture, in the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, what we call the Old Testament, from Moses to Isaiah to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, Amos and others, that Israel would be a nation among the nations of the world in the last days. And so Israel became a nation, May 14th, 1948. Now, officially, it was November 30th of that year, 1948, that the war ended. Israel was born again in May. The war ended in 1948. As a result of the war, there were approximately 400 to 800,000 Arabs who became refugees. There are ongoing disputes about the number. I tend to think that it's upwards of, in the lower number, about 400,000. But regardless, Dave Dolan, in his book, Holy War for the Promised Land, said this: "The historical evidence suggests that while the Israelis deliberately expelled some Palestinian Arabs following months of bitter fighting, most left of their own volition or at the behest of local Arab commanders. And the overwhelming majority actually left of their own volition or because of the Arab commanders. You leave, we'll win. You go back, you have your home, you have your neighbor's home. Now, the War of Independence, Samuel Katz, in his book Battleground, he writes about the Arab claim of Jewish expulsion of Arabs. Here's what he says. The fabrication can most easily be detected by the simple circumstances that at the time the alleged expulsion of the Arabs by Zionists was in progress, nobody noticed it. Foreign newspapermen abounded in the country, but even those most hostile to the Jews saw nothing to suggest that the flight of the Arabs was not voluntary. In the 3 months that the major part of the flight took place, the London Times, a newspaper most notably hostile to Zionism, published 11 leading articles on the situation in Palestine, in addition to extensive news reports. In none was there even a remote hint that the Zionists were driving Arabs from their homes. Even more pertinent, no Arab spokesman made such a charge. At the height of the flight, the Palestinian Arabs' chief UN representative, Hamal Husseini, made a long political statement, this was on April 27, 1948, that was not lacking in hostility toward the Zionists. He did not mention refugees. The Secretary General of the Arab League, Azam Pasha, made a fiercely worded political statement on Palestine. It contained not a word about refugees. When 4 months after the war began, the prospect of the flightlings returning in a few weeks had faded. There were some recriminations. Emil Gori, a member of the Palestinian Arabs' national leadership, said in an interview with the Beirut Daily Telegraph, quote, "The fact that there are these Arab refugees is the direct consequence of the action of the Arab states in opposing partition and the Jewish state. The Arab states agreed upon this policy unanimously, and they must share in the solution of the problem." Close quote. It's important to note some things as we understand the Israel-Palestinian issue with what happened back in the beginnings of the nation of Israel in 1948, the modern nation of Israel. Number one, there has never been a Palestinian state. Never. Nor even a Palestinian people, you could argue. Secondly, Arabs up to this time were never called Palestinians. It was actually considered an insult to refer to an Arab as a Palestinian. Third, Jewish people who were in the land of what was called Palestine before the birth of the nation of Israel in 1948, they were the ones actually referred to as Palestinians. For example, the Palestinian Post, which is today the Jerusalem Post, a Jewish newspaper. Same with the Palestinian or the Palestine Symphony, Jewish symphony orchestra. The Palestine Electric Company, that was a Jewish electric company. The Potash Company, the Palestine Potash Company, Jewish company. And you could go on and on. British authorities, who had the mandate over that area until Israel became a nation in May of 1948, they would issue the passports to the subjects in that area, whether they be Jewish or Arab. They issued the Jewish passports stamped with the word Palestinian. They didn't do this for the Arab people. Here, for example, you have a copy of a passport that was issued by the British Authority, who had the mandate over Palestine prior to Israel becoming a nation in 1948. Now, I've highlighted some things. I want you to notice something right there. This passport was issued to Joshua ben Abba Shirley de Florence, if I can read that correctly. It's a Jewish name. It's a Jewish person. And it was authored by the Palestinian Citizenship Order of 1925. You can see the Hebrew in this passport. This was given to a Jewish resident of the area of Palestine as Britain was under the control of the area, and they were referred to, the Jewish inhabitants, as Palestinian citizens. Fourth, it's important to note, in March 1921, when Winston Churchill was British colonial secretary, he visited Jerusalem, met with a delegation of local Arab dignitaries who told him they would brook no sovereign Jewish entity in what they called southern Syria. That's from David Fromkin's A Peace to All and Peace book. Number 5. After World War I, Aref al-Aref, colleague of the Mufti Amin al-Husseini, was editor of a newspaper called Syria al-Junubiyah, Southern Syria. There was a local Arab leader, Ani Bey Abdul Hadi, in writing to the British Peel Commission, speaking to them in 1937, he said this: "There is no such country as Palestine. Palestine is a term the Zionists invented." Now, that's not correct, but understand what he is saying. There's no such country as Palestine. He goes on and says, our country was for centuries part of Syria. Palestine is alien to us. It is the Zionists who introduced it. He recognized that this area, the world refers to as Palestine, is part of greater Syria, southern Syria. In 1939, the Arab Awakening, writing the book, the Arab historian George Antonius described the status of Palestine. In it, he said this: "Except where otherwise specified, the term Syria will be used to denote the whole country of that name, which is now split into mandated territories of French Syria and Lebanon, and British Palestine and Transjordan." An Arab historian telling us that Palestine is part of Syria. In 1946, a leading Arab historian, Princeton University history professor Philip Hitti, reiterated the pan-Arab view, as across the Arab world, when he decried the term Palestinian because it referred to Jews. He said, quote, "There is no such thing as Palestine in history. Absolutely not," close quote, he asserted. It's a leading Arab historian in 1946. Ahmad Shikari, Saudi delegate to the UN and later head of the PLO in 1956, in the UN Security Council said this: "There's no such thing as Palestine in history. Absolutely not." It's important to note as we continue on with this, and this comes from Zahir Muhsin, who was in the PLO Executive Committee He was interviewed in a Dutch newspaper in 1977. He said this: "The Palestinian people does not exist. The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel, for our Arab unity. In reality today, there is no difference between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. Only for political and tactical reasons do we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people. Since Arab national interests demand that we posit the existence of a distinct Palestinian people to oppose Zionism." He was up front. There's never been a Palestinian state. There's never been a Palestinian people. And the only reason we refer to a Palestinian state and the Palestinian people, the Arabs, it's a political ploy. It's a tactical ploy to oppose the nation of Israel. I want to show you this picture. This is a Larousse French dictionary from 1939. In the appendix, it lists all the then current flags of the world. Remember, this is 1939. Israel was born in 1948. It lists them in alphabetical order. You'll notice that for Germany at that time, the flag was the Nazi one, replete with swastika. And I put a black box around the Nazi flag, and you can see it on the left part of the screen, the left part of that dictionary page. That's the German flag with the Nazi symbol, obviously pre-State of Israel. Now, alphabetically, look for the Palestinian flag. And I have put a box around that. Yes, there is one in this French dictionary from 1939. What does it look like? I've enlarged it. It says Palestine. But what does it have in the center of that flag? It's blue and white. They have a Star of David. Clearly showing that the area of Palestine and the people of Palestine were understood to be the Jewish people. Very revealing. The Arab world in that area wanted nothing to do with the term Palestinian. They were proud Syrians, Greater Syria. The land ownership in Israel in 1949. 8.6% of it was purchased by Jewish people, much of it just being swamps, absentee Arab landowners who sold it to Jewish people at exorbitant price. 71.2% were state lands. That is, they were lands that were under the control of the British, under the British mandate, that passed to the nation of Israel when the nation was born in 1948. 16.9% of the land in Israel was abandoned by Arab owners. Those were Arabs who left at the behest of the Arab world and the Arab nations. Leave, we're going to drive the Jews into the sea. And then you can go back and get your property and your neighbor's Jewish property as well. Well, Israel considered them enemy combatants. They sided with the enemy and left. And 17%, 16.9% of the land is abandoned by Arab owners. 3.3% of the land remained in possession of Arab owners who did not flee the land. They stayed in their homes. Now, this comes from land ownership in Palestine, 1880 to 1948 by M. Alman, the Israel Academic Committee, Jerusalem, 1976. The population of the land in 1517, at the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, was approximately 1,000 Jews living there. Some 50 years later, roughly, 1566, there were 10,000 Jews. That number didn't change by the 1800s, or in 1800. 10,000 Jews, some 25,000 Christians, and 250,000 Sunni Muslims. Now, the Arab population in Palestine, which would be modern-day Israel and Jordan, in 1882 was about 260,000. Most lived in mud huts without sanitation, and the average farm was roughly 25 acres. There was no separate political or administrative entity before 1914. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, but they didn't have any political system that was directly related to that area. You can look at the population of Palestine, Israel from 1553 to 2013. In 1800, around 246,000. 2013, 1.6 million Muslims. In 1800, 24,000 Jewish people. Today, or in 2013, some 6 million. Today it's about close to 7 million Jewish people in the land. There's always been a Jewish presence in the area of Palestine. Sometimes small, but literally for the last 3,000 years, back to the time of David, there's always been a presence in the land of Jewish people. In 1949, the armistice agreements with Egypt, February 24th, Lebanon, March 23rd, Transjordan, April 3rd, Syria, July 20th. Following the War of Independence, armistice agreements left Israel with about 7,800 square miles. Remember earlier, Transjordan, and they took everything east of the Jordan River and gave it to the Arabs for another Arab state. Everything west was to be a Jewish state. Well, in these armistice agreements, they then took everything west of the Jordan River and they divided it again. And they left Israel with roughly 7,800 square miles. You can again see it in the blue. The land that was to have become part of the Arab state, about 2,200 square miles, was divided into the West Bank. Occupied, ultimately, and illegally annexed by Jordan and the Gaza Strip as well. You can see that just little sliver on the bottom portion or the left portion of Israel on the Mediterranean. This was occupied and held as an administrative area by Egypt until Jordan illegally occupied and annexed these. Thus, because they illegally occupied the area, April 24th, 1950, Transjordan became Jordan. No longer were they only across the Jordan River, east of the Jordan River. They were now on both sides of the Jordan River. So they dropped the trans. Jordan formally annexed the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, declaring, quote, complete unity between the two sides of the Jordan and their union in one state, at whose head reigns King Abdullah ibn al-Hussein. And so again, against what the world had agreed on, the Arabs, backed by the world, carved out a portion of what should have gone to Israel, which is today known as the West Bank, that tan or light brown area in the map. Jordan, their annexation of the West Bank was regarded as illegal and void by the Arab League and others. It was only recognized by Britain, Iraq, and Pakistan. The annexation of the West Bank more than doubled the population of Jordan. This was illegal under international law. Only Britain, Iraq, and Pakistan recognized the annexation. Most of the Arab nations at that time rejected it. And the Arab League did, and most of the world. But it became a fact of history. History has a way of being turned upside down at times. The reality of what took place is that when Israel was born, they became a nation. And ultimately, to try to destroy Israel, the Arabs would embrace what historically spoke of the Jewish people, what historically spoke of the land of Israel, meaning Palestine and Palestinians. And that was certainly the understanding prior to 1948, would be turned upside down and to become a propaganda tool of the Arab world to try to ultimately destroy the Jewish nation, which they didn't defeat in the War of Independence in 1948. Next time we get together, we'll continue our look at understanding the Israel and Palestinian issue.